My name is Laura Stoner, and I'm here with Len Tran and Emily Raymond, and we're interviewing you about your experience coming to America from Vietnam. Um, how are you doing today?
Very good, and nice to see you, Laura, as well as Emily. And this is a pleasure to be talking to both of you.
It is January 18th, 2024, and we're on StreamYard doing this interview. Can you start by telling me your full name?
Sure, my full name is Len Tran. My Vietnamese name is Vinh Len Tran.
Okay. And when were you born and where were you born?
I was born on May 16, 1975, in Central Hue, Vietnam. The province is Thuong An, which is a countryside part of Hue.
Mhm. And what did your parents do for a living?
At that time, my mom was a housewife. My dad was on the verge of becoming a medical doctor. And right before when he's supposed to be certified as a doctor, that's when we left on our journey, which I probably going to expound a little bit later on.
And did you have any siblings?
Yes, I do. So in 1982, when I left Vietnam, I had three sisters and one younger brother, and one was expected.
Hmm. And what um so you left Vietnam in 1982. What was your family's reasoning for wanting to leave Vietnam?
So after 1975, which is the fall of Saigon, and when the we call it the Viet Cong, or also the communists that took over the country, many lives have changed, including my family's life as well. During that time, we were living in the countryside, and hundreds and thousands of Vietnamese were leaving the country at that time. My father decided to leave the country as well. The only way to leave was by boat. Fortunately or unfortunately, my hometown was right at where the ocean located, which provides us an easy access to leave by boat. And
Mhm.
so in 1982, my father made a tough decision um, whether to leave the country with the entire family or only able to bring one person. And so, being the, until today, I probably don't even know the answer, and I have to get back to my dad. I thought, being the oldest son, he brought me along, but he had to choose one person, and so he chose me to go with him to leave the country in 1982, and we became the Vietnamese boat people.
Did you Do you know if he had a plan, that he understood how the refugee process worked? Um,
Not at all. He had no plan. Well, he has no idea how that worked. What he knew was that we just have to escape, and so he planned with some of his friends in early April, I believe, early April of 1982. Um, he had it all planned out that, okay, 25 people are going to get on a small fishing boat, which I believe approximately 20 feet long and maybe 4 or 5 feet wide. And each person or each adult can only take one person along with them, whether it's another child or their spouse, but they cannot take the entire family.
mhm.
I think the part of the reason was because, it's a dangerous journey. When you get on a boat, you're going out into the South China Sea. Whether you're gonna find freedom or whether you're just gonna find death. So the risk is, it's better to have two people die versus the entire family. And so that was a tough decision that he had to make, to take me along with him. So that was the plan between him and his friends. the plan for him to take me, I remember in the afternoon of 1982, he just grabbed me by the hand and he said, Len, we're gonna go to the city so that we can visit your uncle, because at that time my uncle was living in the city of Hue, where we would take at least a day and a half to get there to go see him, because we got to take the ferry along with a car ride. So I walked with the dad, and I was like, yeah, I'm so excited. We're gonna go to the city. The next thing I knew, we were walking along the beach, and then he said, okay, we're gonna have dinner, and we're gonna sleep in this little hut. So I, being eight years old at that time, I didn't know what was going on. I was just so happy that I'm going to the city, and that I'm with my dad. And so we walked along the beach, having dinner, slept in the hut, and the very next morning at dawn, someone just grabbed me and just threw me over the shoulder and ran across the beach, and I was like a little bit awake, and I was wondering what's going on, until he threw me into the boat, and I was screaming, Dad, Dad, and then he just covered my mouth and he said, shut up, you're gonna get us killed. And right when he removed his hand, I screamed again. I was just so scared. And then I saw my dad, and he said, Len, just stay in the boat, just be quiet. So I sat there, and I saw in front of me women and other children were sitting and all scared. And within minutes, my dad and all the men would just jump into the boat, because they were helping to push the boat out to the sea. And we were supposed to go with two boats. One of the boat has the compass. Our boat does not, because we were supposed to follow them. But during that kind of situation, basically people just got in the boat and just leave right away, because if we were to get caught, our lives would be over. I've heard stories that they would stone you to death if you were to get caught. And so the other boats left us, and when we got out to mid-sea, we were lost. We were lost. The captain stopped the engine and just said, okay, let the journey begin. And that's when I looked at my dad, and I said, Dad, what journey? Where are we going? We're supposed to go visit my uncle. What's going on? And he didn't say anything, and I still remember, the brim of tears was falling down from his face, and he didn't say a word, and I was like, okay, you know what, I'm just with Dad, and that's what's important to me at this point. Next thing I knew, it was the beginning of our journey to find freedom.
Did what kind of provisions were on the boat, and how was the boat constructed? Was it a boat and honestly built, like they found a boat to use, or did someone construct the boat?
So it was an ordinary fishing boat that we used in our village to go fishing. Very simple boat, just basically platform and a two-cylinder engine in the back. I now that I saw it last week when I went back to Vietnam, I was like, I can't believe this boat could carry 25 people in 1982. I have heard many boat people stories, and they were in a much bigger boat than we were. The ones that we have were very minimal. I'm just baffled by how much we wanted to find freedom so much that we couldn't care less what kind of means we used to get there. Because that boat, I mean, in a heavy storm, we can be flipped very easily. It's caved like a very sharp arc that it's not able to withstand any kind of tough storm. And I'm gonna have a story to share about that as well when we faced the storm, because it was a 21 days at sea.
Wow. And you never ran into the other boat?
Yeah, so we never found out about the other boat until we reached Hong Kong. So right after that day when we lost that boat, it took us 21 days at sea before we were found and got rescued. And and I remember the first 5 days where we were just so lost, and we ran out of food, fuel, and water. Luckily, there was a nearby island which is called Hainan, and Hainan is part of China. But during that time, I believe that people in Hainan knew about the Vietnamese boat people because they had seen so much. I mean, right after the Vietnam War, right after 1975, there were so many people escaped the country by boat. That they have seen so much, and they understood why. So when they saw us, and we have men who just remove their white T-shirt and start waving, and I believe a white T-shirt represents surrendering, and they knew. So what they did was they put food in a plastic bag, as well as cartons of fuel, and they just threw in the middle of the ocean. And then we would just slowly get there. And I believe the reason why they did that was they were also scared of us too. I mean, in a desperate situation, they might think that we're just gonna overtake their boat or their ship. But it was very generous of them to do that. But after 5 days, it's very difficult to have that much food to sustain 25 people. And so on the fifth day, we were about to give up. There were a bunch of us just lying in the middle on the platform of the boat, and it was hot. We were exhausted, and suddenly I saw a storm approaching us. And I looked to Dad, and I can see that that petrified look in on his face, and I was like, "Oh my God, what's going on?" And the wind started to pick up, and the waves started to move faster, and was splashing onto the side of the boat. And then as it approached closer, I start feeling raindrops, and that's when, especially the women on the boat, they were holding the kids, and they start crying. And next thing I knew, I saw Dad put both his hands together and started praying, and I did the same thing. Growing up as a Buddhist, that's what my grandmother taught me. It's every time when you need help, just put your hands together and pray to to Buddha. And so the entire boat did that. And when the storm was just right on top of the boat, and I could remember vividly, the boat was just rocking so hard, and it was chaotic. People were crying, screaming, and bracing onto the side of the boat, just being ready to face death. And then suddenly there was a downpour, and it was exactly what we needed at that time, which was water.
Mm.
And I remember all of us just cupped our hands and just try to contain as much water as we could, and drank from that from the cup of our hands. And there were people just scuttling just to get pots and pans just to capture as much water as we could. And then right after that, the clouds just moved away, and we saw this rays of sunlight, and that just gave us hope. So after that incident, it just makes me believe more in the divine, that when you pray, um, you will be heard.
Hmm. Did you fish after the 5 days to support yourselves?
Yeah. So luckily, after that incident, the captain finally able to see land. And when he saw land, he was like, "Okay, you know what? Let's go along the coast of whatever this country is," because we knew after 5 days we already lost Vietnam, right? So when he saw land, he got closer, and then when he sees like there's a village existing on that land, then he moves closer, and that's when we found out that we actually hit Hanam. So we docked our boat right on the beach. Everyone got off, and I remember my goodness, when you sit on a boat for so long, you step off the boat and just walk on land. It's like you're floating on on air. Um, and so we got off there, and the people in the village of Hainan were extremely friendly. They were, they brought us rice, and they put a lot of water. What we call it kanji is just basically rice soup, and so they gave us that. Um, just to be able to have some kind of a solid food in our tummy at that time was just beyond grateful, right? So we stayed there for a day. Some of the men would go out and luckily also on the boat we have a fishing net, so they would just go around with the net and try to scoop up as much fish as we can. And when you're close to the beach, the only fish that we get are the little ones. But we're just so used with that in our country, that we scoop on so much of that, and we just put everything in a pot and just cook it. I forgot how they cook it. Probably just use the spice that we have, just only salt. I'm sure we don't bring all the other essential ingredients. But it was anything that we get to eat at that time was the best food. And so we did that basically from every shore that we would see. The captain would just pull in, and this time that he knew, we don't want to face another storm like that, because we just don't know. I mean, the first time we might be lucky, but not the second time. So we just stopped, from shore to shore, from shore to shore, up until the 21st day, when we were close to Macau, which is near Hong Kong, and I remember I was seeing these it's not jet ski, it's these boats where it has two metal rail on the bottom, and it was going pretty fast. And we were like, "Oh, what's that?" I'm being from the countryside. Of course, none of us knew, what kind of device or fancy boat that was, but we were amazed by it. Um, and then that's when my dad was like, "Well, it looks like we are close to Hong Kong," because that was the ideal situation, is to go to Hong Kong to be able to be rescued. And within I said within an hour, suddenly we saw this big ship, approaching us. And that's when, men and all the kids would just remove their shirt and just start waving, praying, screaming. And when they got close to us, we knew that that we were about to be rescued. And I remember they threw a rope ladder down to the side of the ship, and we would grab that ladder so that our boat would be together with the ship, tied together. And they told us just, and luckily at that time my dad was able to speak a little bit of English, so he was the translator. And we would climb up, but they said only the women and the kids, not the men. I don't know why. Probably they're afraid, again, that when you have, I don't know, they might overtake the ship or whatever, but they just only being precautious, right? So then we climbed up, and I was like, Dad, come on up. And the Coast Guards were like, no, he had to stay there. So they were moving our boat along with the ship, probably another 30 minutes ride, and they brought us to a barge right in the middle of the ocean. And that's when they told all the men to get up, and they brought the entire 25 of us and put us on a barge. And I remember walking from the ship to the barge, and I was like, oh my goodness, there were hundreds, maybe 1,000 of Vietnamese refugees like us, sitting in a barge to wait what is next. And I remember they lift our ship on a crane and just put it into some kind of bin and just smash that ship. I guess it's also because they don't want us use that our boat to go anywhere or whatever. But during that time, the only the only thing that we wanted is just to be rescued. We couldn't care less of what they do with our boat, and we were on the barge for a couple of days until they brought us to Hong Kong, and the next thing we knew, we were in a refugee camp in Hong Kong.
And what was the refugee camp like? Did you stay with the group of 25 consistently, or were you split up?
Yeah. So when we got to the refugee camp, it was dangerous at that time. We didn't find out until 2-3 days later. Some of us stayed together, some of us were scattered because it all depending on the space that they have. The camp is huge, and you have hundreds of people in the camp. It's just basically a box, right? And then they have bunk beds, right? Not fancy bunk beds, just metal rods holding very unstable beds, and it just goes from one end all the way to the other end. I remember during that time, the reason why it was very dangerous because they have the southern Vietnamese people as well as the northern Vietnamese people living together. Now, based on the Vietnam War, because when the North, took over the South, we had this idea that we don't know, who's real and who's not real. So there were a lot of fighting going on in the camp in itself. There were incidents where people got killed, and Dad was so scared. He's like, I'm the only son that he brought with me, and because of my safety, he's constantly around me, and every day, even while sleeping, we are also cautious of what's next. Would there be another fight happening that someone can just throw something and I'll get hit by it, or and get injured or get killed. But it was a scary 3 months living in the Hong Kong refugee camp. But that's also a place where I get to learn my first English as well, because they had someone from America who came into the camp and taught kids my age a little bit of English before they allowed us to go to the Philippines, which is our next step.
When you were at the refugee camp, did you understand that you had any choices as to where you were going? Like, I think some people said they would, like Australia or somewhere with, not just the US, was an option for them to relocate. Did you have any sense that there was any choice, or did you always think you were going to the United States?
Yeah, so that was the thing too. Dad was the only one who, because I was just too young, so every time when they interview, they would just have him to come into the office and interview. Luckily for my father's situation, it was rather quick. For us, it only took us 3 months, and when they interview him, he gave them the experience enough of. I don't know how much documents he brought with him. That I have to verify again, but if I remember correctly, he told me that during the interview, and because that he had worked with the U.S. Soldiers when they were in Vietnam, and also we are going to have a sponsor in America as well. So that will be our next destination. That will be America. And for us, it took us 3 months in living in the refugee camp in Hong Kong before going to the Philippines. But other people who I knew were in our boat actually stayed for 6 months to a year before they were approved to go to the Philippines and then coming to America. So for my situation with Dad, it seemed as though we were already designated for the America versus, you're right, other people who had gone to Australia.
Did your dad Did his medical training give him any kind of advantage in the, like, finding the sponsor and everything, or was it more about his service to the troops and the US during the war?
I believe it. I, I I believe it wasn't really his experience that gave him the advantage. It was more of was his paperwork and his answers were aligned as to someone is really seeking asylum, leaving the country for the purpose of finding freedom. Um, and so someone, actually, it was a organization called HIAS, HIAS. I believe it's a Jewish organization in New York City, and
Mhm.
so they were the ones who just reach out and said, they were able to sponsor this amount of people, and so our category just fall right along with that with their criteria, and so we were able to get picked up by them.
Did they have
So
translators at the camp, or was your dad already speaking some English?
Yeah, they had translators at that time as well. Yeah.
Mhm.
But luckily, yeah, because my dad was born at the time when the French took over Vietnam, so he had
Uh-huh.
to learn French when the Vietnam War, when the American soldiers came over. He also learned quite a bit of English, so it's very lucky that he can carry on a conversation at that time. Not the best conversation, but enough to understand.
Still, yeah, I think that would be helpful. Could I ask about your life in the countryside a little bit more? Were in Vietnam, and were you going to school, or what was your daily sort of routine there?
Yeah, so at that time, I was 7 years old. Right before I left, we live in the countryside. It was my grandfather, my grandmother, both of my parents, along with 6 kids. So that's what 10 people in a small little home. Um, uh, the home is basically just like a little box. I'm trying to. I was back there last week, and the size is no more than 10 by 15, very very small. Small.
Mhm.
Um, we all slept on the floor. There's no such thing as a mattress. My grandparents were able to sleep on a bed, but the bed is made of hardened wood. So they would sleep on the wood. Everyone else would just sleep on the floor. For the Vietnamese culture, we are very um, loyal as to our lineage. So in every home, there's always an altar. It's an altar with our ancestors. And I remember it was big right in the middle of our home. And then you have their bed on the side, and all of us sleeping on the floor. Outside of our home, we have a separate kitchen. Um,
Hmm.
Kitchen was basically the roof is made of hay, and then the kitchen is using charcoal, and the only source of water that we have is basically the well down the street, and we just get the water there and just put into a container that we have, and then next to the kitchen is what my grandfather built a garden for us. We also raise pigs and chickens. We cannot eat them because we cannot afford to eat them. When they get big enough, then my mom and dad would sell them. Uh, the only meat that I get to eat for my time living in Vietnam was pretty much fish, right? Because we live next to the ocean. There's the only means of getting meat. On days that we don't have fish, we eat cactus. We eat cactus for as a source of solid food. And I still joke with my friends nowadays. I'm like, hey, back in the 80s, I'm eating cactus, in Vietnam, and now in America, they selling aloe vera and making tons of money. uh, as for school, we had to walk to school In the countryside, there were no cement. Basically, everything is sand, and it's hot. And I never had pair of slippers underneath my feet. Both my sisters, my older sister, and I would just walk to school barefoot and holding a bucket of water, and we would just run as fast as we can, and then pour the water onto our feet, just just to stay cool. And we would just do that until we get to the school, because walking on sand, it was just that hot.
Mhm.
Going to school in Vietnam, especially that time when the communists took over, basically in every school it would have Ho Chi Minh on at the front, and we would just stand up and recite. It's been so long, I forgot what we recite to, but basically acknowledge him that he is the savior, and going to school there was pretty strict. You don't listen, you get hit. You get hit pretty bad. You get hit in front of in the entire class. And being in second grade in Vietnam, I didn't learn much, especially in the countryside. We were just so poor. Basically, finding ways to put food in our mouth is primary. Getting an education was just just keeping us busy. So my time, my education in Vietnam was very limited. My dad was lucky enough because he was already at that status of becoming a medical doctor, and he had to go into the city to continue his education. So from time to time, he will come back to the countryside and be with us.
Mhm.
Did you live with your mother or was it your mother or your father's family, these grandparents?
My father's side. So so for the Vietnamese tradition, every time when you marry into the husband family, you have to move in and live with them. But my mother's parents would just nearby, not far away.
Do you have any favorite memories of Vietnam? Things that you found, entertaining or cherished as a child?
So when I wrote my book, Split Up by the Sea, my memoir, I opened up the chapter by talking about my grandfather, and he is basically my role model. When my father was not around, my grandfather was not around, being that he was in the city trying to pursue and becoming the medical doctor. My grandfather pretty much take care of all of us kids, right? While my mother, cooks or doing her housework. My grandfather is a carpenter, and he was one of the carpenter who builds these fishing boats. So essentially, the boat that I was on, I don't know if it was built by him, but he was one of those carpenter in the village who would build these boats. And I remember, on a daily basis, always being around my grandfather, and living in the countryside. There's really not much to do, but to fly a kite. And I remember days where I want to fly a kite, and to make a kite, we don't have glue in the countryside, so we actually use rice. We use rice as glue. I remember the time where Grandpa would tell me to get the papers, and then because again, he's a carpenter, so he would get these wood, and he would cut it into small little pieces where he can bend them, and then I would run back up to the house and beg Mom, say, Mom, can I have please a little rice? Because I mean, we don't throw away food. You're just so poor, you don't throw away food. I said, Mom, just give me some rice because Grandpa's making a kite for me. And I would bring that rice down, and then it would smear it, thin enough, and then it would turn the flaps over and just press it on, and it would stick. So it's kind of funny when I arrived to America, I continued to use rice as glue, and until my friends introduced me to what's that called? Elmer's.
Elmer's.
We use rice. It's free.
You don't need a special product to glue things together.
Yep.
Did you, when you and your father left Vietnam, was it an understanding that you were going to bring your grandparents eventually to the U.S. too, and did they make it?
And that was the question, right? When Dad decided to leave Vietnam, I don't think he knew that we're gonna make it. I still believe that he thought we were gonna die, and so when he brought me along with him, I remember that afternoon. It was really strange. He got a bag of mooncake. Mooncake is these special thick condensed cake with nuts inside, and is cherished by Vietnamese people. So I remember him digging a hole in the back of the house, and he buried the mooncake. And part of it is, if my family would ever to be hungry, and if they ever to discover this mooncake there, at least that's going to be food. And so it was a strange afternoon. It's like Dad is predicting that, if Len and I are gonna die, at least the family can still survive for a few more days eating this stuff. So I don't think he ever had that thought that he's gonna make it to America and then sponsoring his family to come over. Because during that time in 1982, it was still relatively brand new, right? Because right after the Vietnam War in 1975, when people were leaving the country, no one thought of being able to sponsor the family to come over, up until, I would say, at least the 90s, right? Until the 90s, when America signed that agreement to say, hey, if anyone, if any Vietnamese who already lived here, or anyone who was involved with the military, that now you're able to go back and sponsor your family member. But during the time that Dad left, I don't think he had any of that in mind. It's more of like, okay, let's see if we're gonna find freedom for the sake of finding freedom. But I don't think he thought anything beyond that, up until when we lived in America, and we had that opportunity to do so, to sponsor, and that's when Dad decided to sponsor the family over.
Okay, so let's go to when you arrive in the Philippines. What did you think about the Philippines? And I mean, I guess it's a similar climate and everything, but what was your impressions of the refugee situation in the Philippines?
Yeah, so the Philippines was much different from Hong Kong. Hong Kong, they kept us in a refugee camp, and like I said, it's like you live in a big I don't know what you call it. In Hong Kong, the refugee camps are being surrounded by gates, and on top of the gates there are barbed wires, just like
so it's almost like a prison.
Yeah, like a prison. And the reason why they had that was because some of the Vietnamese Vietnamese refugees, they actually climb over the gate to go outside to the city, buy something, and then come back. And I remember times where the police would just beat the heck out of the refugees, right? Because they don't want us to go out there. It's dangerous for the people of Hong Kong, and it's also make them scared, right? But then later on, they decided, okay, I'm going to put barbed wire so none of us can climb over, and it's understandable. When we arrived to the Philippines, it was completely different. Right? They actually have us lived in a small hut, and each hut, there were like 4 or 5 people to live in there. So nothing, no gates, nothing. It's just like a small village. It's like I'm seeing Vietnam again, except for the sea. And we stay in the Philippines for 5 months. So three months in Hong Kong, 5 months in the Philippines. I believe during that time, anyone who were brought to the Philippines is pretty much prepared to go to America, because in the Philippines, that's when I get to learn more English. It's like every morning when I wake up, it's like, okay, at the end of the town is where all the kids supposed to go there. And we were, sitting in a class environment, and we learned English. While for my dad, it was the same for him, as well as they also gave him a job. They also gave him a job to work, just to prepare him that, when you get to America, this is how life's gonna be. You got to go to work. You got to learn your English. And so stay in the Philippines, while it was longer, yet it was a nice preparation, and our lives were a little bit more free versus living in Hong Kong refugee camp.
So you were allowed to go where you wanted in the Philippines outside of your hut.
Right. So being raised in the countryside, beside eating fish and cactus for 8 years, and in Hong Kong, I was also limited as well. They mainly gave us rice with bean sprout. It's like every day. It's like, they just, I don't know, stir fry that bean sprout with rice. Living in the Philippines, I was able to drink for the very first time in my life Coca-Cola.
Oh.
And I actually have a story about that too when we arrived to New York City.
Okay.
But yeah, that was the first time in my life able to drink a soft drink, because I believe during that time a few Americans were over in the Philippines, because I guess they were sent over there to help people like us, and it was hundreds of thousands of us refugees. So we just need as many teachers as we can in order to prepare us.
Did they pay your dad for his job?
Yeah, I believe so. I believe they pay him. That's how we were afford to buy our soft drinks. Yeah.
Did you guys have any other like social activities that you did while you were in the Philippines?
Yeah. Surprisingly, we were there's this I don't know if a jungle, probably not the correct way of putting it, but there's this section of a waterfall, and I remember it was 15-20 minutes walk, and all the Vietnamese would just gather there, and being Vietnamese during that time, every time we see water, it's like, oh, kids just want to swim, including the adults, and I would remember, it's always packed there, and that's our activities. It's the men were able to buy cigarettes, and during that time, if I remember correctly, it's like all men smoke at that time.
Yeah.
So to see them smoke, and see the children enjoy the waterfall, that's like the best thing that could happen to us. And I believe a few months ago, it was just a random thing that I was flipping through YouTube, and I searched up the place where I stay, which is called Bataan, which was the refugee camp that I stayed. Later on, I think they moved it to another area that's called Palawan. I believe there's still Vietnamese people living there right now, and they actually turned into a Vietnamese village, because some of them, for some reason, could not leave the Philippines. I don't know why, but a few of them, not few, I would say in the thousands, that still got stuck in the Philippines until today. Yeah.
I have a question that I wanted to ask you to go back to Hong Kong. During that time, was your dad, did he have any, did he do any work? We interviewed someone that said that their family, they had like a coffee shop in the refugee camp. So I think maybe there's there might not be like a formal job, but people, you kind of had your own economy within the refugee camp. Was there anything like that going on?
So that only happens in the late 80s and the 90s. When Dad and I got there in 1982, it was so brand new. The camp was just so brand new that none of that existed. My mom, because I didn't know how much is the story, and I'm trying to follow it chronologically. My mom, along with my siblings, also became boat people themselves. They got to Hong Kong in the 90s. When they were in the 90s, it was much more free. the refugee camp actually allows the Vietnamese people to go outside to work. Whereas during our time in the 1980s, they put barbed wire and said, "You guys stuck in here, you ain't going anywhere." So during my mom's time, she was able to go out to work as a maid in order to make money and buy food and bring back and give it to my siblings.
Mhm.
Right, there were people who got products and would sell it in the refugee camp. But in the early 1980s, no, we didn't have that luxury. So it's more of trying to climb over that gate and escape and go out, and then getting beat up when you get back. But we did not have the luxury. Yeah, so it's basically based on the time frame when you were there.
So you had what they gave you, and that was it.
Pretty much, yeah. And
That's
I
so
remember they gave us condensed milk. Oh, it was one of the best sweet thing that I ever ate. And they give you a can of condensed milk. All you have to do is puncture one hole here and one hole here. The reason why you puncture two holes because you suck out from one hole and the other hole would release the
just like
pressure.
air.
Yeah, release. So then I remember sucking that and on that thing. I was like, Dad, this is like the best thing that they gave us. I don't know. I don't remember how often they gave us, but every time they gave us, I'm like, Dad, can I just have the whole can? so there goes my sugar rush.
Okay, so you go to the Philippines and your dad has a job, but you're both learning English and preparing for acclimating into the US.
Right.
Is your dad still like, does he think he can pursue his medical profession, or are they kind of like you're just going to do whatever like I know the requirements for medical degrees vary from country to country, so it's not as easy to transfer your knowledge to another country. What does he think, like what does he want to do in the US when he gets there?
Yeah, correct. And the emphasis when I was growing up, because we was just so poor living in the countryside, that my grandfather always tell my dad, he said, your job is to go to school, and my job is to work. And it doesn't matter how hard grandpa will work. His philosophy is, I want my kid to have a good education, so that their lives can change. He couldn't care less about his life. He's like, I'm old enough already that eventually I'm going to die, but I want your life to change. So that's the entire emphasis of grandpa. So when we finally made it to America in November, late November of 1982, they brought us to New York City. And when they brought us to New York City, it was the South Bronx of New York. Now, in the 1980s, South Bronx probably, if you have the list of the worst this, worst that, forget it, everything is there. So we were placed in the worst place.
A rough neighborhood.
Very, very rough. And they brought us to this apartment. It was already occupied by two other Vietnamese immigrants, two other men, and it was a one-bedroom apartment. They were so incredibly nice. They said, since you have a son, why don't you and Len take over the bedroom, and both of us gonna sleep in the living room. And that's how we did it. And I remember living with them for a couple of days until one of the men were like, "Hey, you want to go treasure hunting?" I was like, "Yeah, Dad, let's go treasure hunting." And right when we got out at the front door, the man was like, "Hey, make a right turn." I was like, "Right turn? That's a dumpster. What do you mean treasure hunting?" So basically, treasure hunting is going through, and New York City apparently has like the biggest dumpster in every building. And that's when I found my very first mattress. I brought a mattress home, and I can smell the garbage, the urine on it. But it was the very first mattress that I had under my back.
Mm.
To me, that was like the biggest treasure. And so when we were living there, they put us on welfare. And it didn't take long until a couple months later, my dad said, you know what, no, let's get off welfare. He said, we finally found the land of opportunity. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pursue my education, and I'm going to go to work. So that's when Dad found work at a pizza shop, and he was, washing dishes and pots and pans and a pizza shop. These pots and pans were bigger. The width is bigger than that. But he was able to do that. And for him, was like, okay, I'm gonna I can work. I don't need financial assistance, and I'm gonna make this happen. And so I spoke to Dad about it. And I said, Dad, you're gonna be a doctor? And he said, yeah, I want to continue to be a doctor. So at the age of 30, well, I was 8, so he's 24, 32. At the age of 32, Dad was like, okay, I'm gonna go, excuse me, I'm gonna go back to school. And the only way that he can go back to school is he has to get his GED. He didn't mind at all. He didn't mind at all that, at the age of 32, he's going to sit, in a class with 18 and 19-year-old kids, right? To get his GED. And he got his GED. And then later on, he said, you know what, I'm going to get my associate degree. And I remember going to school with Dad, right? Because daytime he would, work, and then nighttime he would go to school. And I just got home from my school, and I would walk with Dad from our apartment to the Bronx Community College, which is like a good, 30-minute walk. Sat with him in his class, and eventually he finished his associate degree, and he still wanted to fulfill his medical school. The only problem was exactly what you said. Standards are different here in America versus over there. But for Dad, it was complicated for him because he feel as though time was not on his side at that age, and he needs to find money quick, because that was also the time where my family back in Vietnam knew that we made it to America. So we had to send, something back to Vietnam in order for my family to survive. At the same time, he's trying to support both of us as well. So that's when he decided not to pursue his medical school and do engineering instead. So Dad enrolled himself in a 4-year college, Pratt Institute of New York in Brooklyn, and he got his engineering degree, and that's when our lives changed. Was when he became an engineer. But Dad always surprised me when I entered college. He after 2 years, he knocked on my door and he said, Len, I'm going back to school. I'm like, going back to school for what? You already got your degree, Dad. What are you going back to school for? And then he said, I want to get my master's degree. And the worst part is this. He said, I'm going to school with you. I'm like, what do you mean you go to school with me, Dad? I don't need you to go to school with me. He actually enrolled in City College of New York with me. While I was pursuing my bachelor degree, he pursued his master degree. And I remember in 1998, we both graduated together. And he sat just 6 seats in front of me, getting his master degree, and I got my bachelor's. Yeah.
So how did you keep in touch with your family when you guys were traveling? And like, how much could you update them when you got to Hong Kong, or could you update them when you got to the Philippines? And then how did you continue communicating?
Yeah, I believe it was probably in the Philippines, because we were, we had more freedom, and Dad had money to I guess to buy
Mail,
postage and mail, right? So he sent letters to my family, and during that time, it's very difficult to send any types of mail to the countryside. So he sent everything to his brother, which was supposed to be my uncle that we supposed to visit instead of taking this journey to find freedom. And so he let my uncle knew, and that's why my uncle traveled to the countryside to let my grandpa and my mom knew that we made it to the Philippines and that we were safe.
And then when you came to the US, how did you all keep in touch then?
Yeah. So same thing. Everything was basically back to my uncle. I remember at times when Dad would buy clothing and at thrift shops. That's pretty much our go-to store during that time, and we try to buy as much as he had during that time. Whatever that Dad made is basically what he bought and box it up and just send it over to my uncle, and then hoping that he would be able to bring it to the countryside and give it to my mom and my siblings.
So how did you have a community in New York that helped kind of look after you when your dad was doing all of these educational pursuits?
So I never had a good childhood at all in the South Bronx. While Dad was busy with his school and working, at the age of 8, I was at home alone. After a few months living with the other 2 gentlemen, they moved out. They moved to a different borough. I believe they moved to Brooklyn, something like that. So it was only Dad and me at home. Unlike today, where you have a kid at home, the parents probably in big trouble.
Yeah.
I was living pretty much at that time without a mom and without a dad, let's say, because Dad would wake up early in the morning and like around 6, 7 o'clock, and he would have to go to work. Afterwards, he would just go to school and he won't get home till late. There are times that he would leave me a note and said, Len, just go home and take care of yourself. So at the age of 8, I learned how to cook on my own. I remember walking to the supermarket buying sardines in a can. I got all my ingredients and I would just cook it for Dad. I learned how to use the gas stove. I cooked rice without pressing the button. I actually put rice in a pot, and I remember how Mom did it, and I would cook from scratch in a pot. Not like nowadays where I tell my kids just press a button, cook, and then 30 minutes later they have their rice done.
Mm-hmm.
I would prepare dinner for Dad, and going to school in New York City at that time was rather strange, right? I'm like, well, I'm only 8 years old. There's no bus. I had to walk more than a mile from my apartment to the school, and the walk was extremely dangerous. It's not like you walk along the sidewalk. There's only a portion of it is along the sidewalk. The other half of the portion is walking along the highway.
No.
I mean, even though it's separated, it was very dangerous. I mean, if I would have gotten kidnapped at that time, my dad would never been able to find me. That's how dangerous it was. I'm the only child who would walk along that sidewalk. At times, I would cry. I was like, why is that? Sometimes I see other kids on the bus or their parents would walk them, but not my dad.
Mm-hmm.
But I got to that point where Dad was also busy in the Philippines, where he was doing his thing and I was doing my thing, and so I kind of got used to it. Every time when I feel sad, I'm like, I'm used to this. I should be a big boy, and Dad always reminded me that I should be a big boy. I was verbally abused. I was physically bullied because kids during that time just didn't know any better. They were calling me names that some of them I understand, some of them I don't, but I'm sure they're just as bad. I would cry most nights, and I would tell Dad. I said, Dad, these kids are bullying me, and Dad's response was like, "Oh, just don't bother them." Like, Dad, look at me. Do I look like a guy I'm gonna bother these kids? And he would tell me, just stay strong. There are times where I got beat up bad enough that I would come home bloodied. But the only way to overcome that is Dad keep on telling me that life is going to be better once I get my college degree, and so I became strong. But the person who changed my life was actually in third grade, where I met my ESL teacher, English as second language teacher, and her name is Mrs. McKeever. Surprisingly, I still stay in contact with her today after 41 years. And she knew my situation, and she brought me to the side, and she said, I'm going to teach you English. But what really changed my life is when I finished elementary school, when I finished sixth grade, my dad was not able to be there to see my graduation. Mrs. McKeever was there. She gave me a gift, and it was a cross pen. And when she said, I believe in you, that changed the whole world. And I used that pen to write her letters all the time. Even though she was living in upstate New York, which is like I believe an hour and a half away from the school where she was teaching. I still write to her. I treated her as though she's the mom that I never had. And so throughout my entire life in seventh grade and high school, I've always contacted her. And there are times when I was feeling down, and it was her who helped me to become strong and brave again. So there's always someone in your life that you're thankful for, and she's one of them that helped me overcome all of the pain from being bullied, and when other people don't believe in you, having her around really helps me emotionally.
Oh, I'm so glad that you found her, or she found you.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I have dedicated a couple of chapters of her in my book, Split Up by the Sea.
Oh. I'm sorry, Emily, did you have a question?
Well, I just wanted to follow up on the bullying, I guess. Did you feel like that was normal? I don't. It was a rough neighborhood. There's a lot of sort of like, I guess, ethnic friction and gangs and that sort of thing. So did you feel like the bullying was just kind of a result of that? Or do you think it had something to do in some way with the Vietnam War?
I would say the bullying is more of a stupid kids, right?
Mhm.
Stupid kids trying to be stupid, because the area in itself is was just poor. They put all the Vietnamese immigrants in that area, along with the blacks and Hispanics. Vietnamese during that time was just portrayed as weak, and so the blacks and Hispanics were like, okay, you know what, you guys are just like I don't know, in other words, like meat for us to
Yeah.
prey on.
Yeah.
So when they want to rob us, they just come over and rob us. My one of my friend was robbed right in front of McDonald's in the South Bronx, and they just took those long umbrellas and at the bottom of the umbrella you see this piece of was it 4 inches of metal rod, and they just punctured right at his temple and just
Oh.
right through. Yeah. Luckily, he did not die, but we had to bring him to the hospital. So incident like that. The bullying got so bad among the Vietnamese communities that the Hispanics and the blacks would just go after these Vietnamese immigrants. It got so bad that in the 1980s there was actually later on it was very the name of the gang is called Born to Kill. In short, they call it BTK. It's a Vietnamese gang. All right. It got to the point where the Hispanics and the blacks would hear BTK and they would freak out because they pushed us to the point where we had to form a gang. And so I was only 11 or 12 at that time. I was scared, but I was just so used to the bullying that I'm like, hey, you know what? If they're gonna beat me up again today, I'll just take it. A friend of mine couldn't take it anymore. He said, hey, I'm going to join a gang, and this is when he was at the age of 12. He said, I'm gonna join a gang. He was able to possess a gun. And I also have that in my book as well. And when the bullies came up to him, he took that out, pointed in front of them, and they were afraid. And he said, Len, hey, I think you should join this gang with me, and at least you're prepared. Being young, I was about to say, yeah, let's do it. But something just tells me, hey, just don't get involved in this. And I'm so happy that I did not. I also wrote in my book too of this friend, and apparently he died. He got shot at a parking lot, and it was on the New York Times. I guess that's what happened. That we have to do when we are pushed to the corner so much. And I feel bad. I mean, I'm lucky that I did not end up joining a gang to fight against these bullies. But for those who joined the gang, either I don't know. I guess when you're given so much of luxuries, you end up doing other stupid things. I mean, at first you might think that you're protecting yourself from the bullies, but then you might have so much other money or whatever that you start doing other stupid things that also get you killed anyway. And it happened to many other Vietnamese immigrants.
I know that you're involved in martial arts. Did that come out of this at all?
Yeah. So it's kind of funny that after all the bullying and everything, we just couldn't take it. So all these Vietnamese kids in the South Bronx got together, and it was so happened one of the older kids heard of this martial arts instructor, and he's also Vietnamese, and he teaches the art of Vo Vi Nam, which is basically is called the Vietnamese karate. And so we would walk, right? And I'm talking about kids from at that time I was 9-10 years old. We would walk 9-10-year-old kids all the way up to I would say 13-14-year-old kids. We would walk from our apartment all the way to the Bronx Zoo, which is like an hour walk, right? Early in the morning of Saturday morning, just to get there. And the martial art instructor would stand there and wait for us. The only food that we could afford at that time was White Castle. It was like maybe 15-20 cents per burger. I don't know if you ever tried White Castle, but it was so fun being with this group, at the same time being with a martial art teacher, where we felt as though finally we can protect ourselves, right? But when we got there, the very first thing that the teacher told us, he said, "Look, I'm teaching you guys martial art only for health reasons. I don't want you to, try to use this thing, to fight against bullies, because for you to fight against them is asking for trouble anyway." Uh, so he kept emphasizing in our head that, hey, martial art is for health reasons, and I want you guys to, to be healthy, to learn the art of discipline, and not the art of, fighting back. And I didn't understand any of that at that time. I'm like, yeah, whatever, sensei, I'm going to learn this to protect myself anyway. He's right. He's right, because there were times when I got bullied again, and it doesn't matter how much you fight, they still kick your butt anyway. But as I got older, and luckily I have met other martial art teachers as well, and they taught me this beautiful art. And now I myself is a martial artist, a teacher, that currently I am giving back to the community. They taught me for free, so now I'm teaching and I'm giving back to the community for free as well. And this is something that I said that I would say changed my life, my perspective as a person, and it was through martial art.
Do you have the story about? Do you want to tell us the story about Coca-Cola in New York at this time?
Yeah. In the Philippines, you never say Coke. You only say Coca-Cola, right? And so when we got to New York City, I remember and we stayed in Times Square. Now I don't know if you ever been to Times Square in the 80s. Not the best thing the best place you want to be. It was just crazy. You get off the train, and you see a lot of people, lights and stuff like that. But oh my goodness, there were just so many adult places, and I looked at that. I'm like, what's all these? Well, if you do a search, 1980s Times Square, and you see what I'm talking about. It's just more for adult friendly, not for kids at all.
Mm-hmm.
But lucky for us, the lady gave us a $20 bill, and she said, "You guys go and buy food." So the very first place we went to was McDonald's. Look at the menu, didn't know what to order. Looked to our left, and I saw this man was eating, and we're just pointing to that sandwich. Apparently it was a Big Mac. So when she asked us what we want to drink, and so I said Coca-Cola, with my Vietnamese accent. I couldn't say Coca-Cola. I always say Coca-Cola. And she looked at me, she goes, "What?" And I said, "Coca-Cola." And she was like, "What?" And then Dad was like, "Coca-Cola." And she at that time, she was just so frustrated. It was like, "What?" And I just again pointed to that guy with a drink, and she goes, "Coke." We're like, yeah, Coke. So that's when I knew Coca-Cola and Coke was the same thing. But yeah, that. So after that incident, I never say Coca-Cola again, but always Coke. And I thought the Philippines supposed to prepare you for America, right?
Yeah. So did your family eventually join you in New York?
Yeah. So in 1990, I got a collect call. I got an international collect call, and I picked up the phone, and the operator was like, "Oh, we have a collect call. Do you want to accept?" And I was like, who would call me collect? And right before I was able to say I accept, I heard from the other line said, "Len, is that you? This is Mom." I'm like, what? Mom collecting call? Where's she calling me from? And I was like, okay, I'll accept the call. Mom started crying, everything. She's like, "Len, this is Mom. We're in Hong Kong right now. I can't wait to see you and Dad." And I was frozen. I was the only one at home, and Dad wasn't at home at that time. He was working. And I start talking to him like, Mom, how did you get to Hong Kong, stuff like that? And she said, yeah, we got on a boat and we got here. And I finally got your numbers. And up until today, I have to ask her, how did she get our number? But or maybe it was back and forth letter between her and Dad or whatever. So then when Dad got home, and I told Dad about it, and so and that's how we connected. And Dad, try to get the paperwork ready to sponsor over. The differences between Dad and I coming to America was we got sponsored by Highest, right? But for us, for Dad to sponsor my mom to come over, we can skip the Philippines. So they came from the Hong Kong directly to America versus us coming from Hong Kong to the Philippines, stayed there for 5 months, and then coming to America. So we saved them the 5 months, and having the family reunited in the 90s was something that I've waited for a long time. It was fortunate for them and that they didn't have to go through Bronx like the way Dad and I did, and we made their lives more different.
So at that time, had your dad finished his undergraduate degree at that point?
Yeah, that's when he just barely finished. Yeah.
So then, did your family move out of the Bronx when you're?
Yeah. So actually, when Dad was about to finish, we moved to Queens. When you think that you move out of the Bronx to go somewhere else to find a better life, when we moved to Queens, our apartment was only 2 blocks away from well, in New York City they call it the projects, which is like housings,
Government housing.
Yeah, government housing. So we lived only 2 blocks away from there. When you go to school, you have to go to school within the same zone. So apparently the school is in between my apartment and the housing. So we go to the same school. So as much as I thought, okay, finally I'm gonna escape from being bullied. Once again, I was met with the same atmosphere, just different people. Yeah. Yeah. So that was another 2 years of hell for me. I got to the point where every morning when I went to school, and back in the days where they use a compass, a metal rod and a pencil where you draw. I got to the point where I had to tie a compass on my wrist. That's the only way that I'm going to support myself. I was so ready. I was so fed up by continuing to get beat up, and I was 13, 14 at the time. And I said, look, I'm going to put a compass on my wrist. If I have to use it, I have to use it. This is the only way that I can escape from this, because I cannot keep going home being bruised again. And on days that I have a compass on my wrist, nothing happened. On the day that I leave at home, I'm gonna get beat up again. I'm like, oh my goodness, do I have to bring a compass with me all the time like this?
Yeah.
But there's this incident, this incident that really changed my life, and I've been trying to find this person for the last 20, 30 plus years, and I couldn't find him. His name is Rufus, black guy who also lives in the housing projects as well. And I remember getting beat up by these bullies. Rufus just jumped in and he told them, he said, no, just leave him alone. And these guys were looking at him and they said, what you want to get beat up too? And Rufus just told them, I said, look, you got to leave him alone. They keep bullying me, smacking my head. And then Rufus got so angry. And back in the days, we have binders. He would just open his notebook, rip the binder, metal binder out, and smack one of the guys so hard, and the guy was, started bleeding. They got scared. So they all ran away. one of the security guard came over and pulled Rufus into the principal's office. I was so scared, and I said, "Look," I was like, "These guys were hurting us," and Rufus was just defending himself. After that day was the last time that I saw Rufus, because there were rumors going around that they planned to kill him, and so I lost contact with Rufus, and yeah, I never knew his last name, but it would be so nice if someday I can find him again, because I really thanked him, because after that incident, there were less bullying. There was less bullying because either the school did something, which I doubt, but these bullies knew that one of us can go crazy and we can retaliate. And I think that's because of that. They didn't completely stop, but it lessened.
Did you have to warn your siblings about being in the school system?
My siblings got it all lucky, right? It's like it's like I paved the way for for them somehow. When they came, we were living at the same spot. The school system somewhat changed a little bit. There's not as much bullying going around. None of my siblings experienced it. It was strange somehow. Yeah, and it's kind of funny too. I mean, even nowadays, I ask my kids, I'm like, just wondering, you guys get any bullying going on? It's like, Dad, no, none of that happened. The only thing we get bullying is probably on Instagram or TikTok, where someone just don't like some of your the stuff that you post. I'm like, okay, well, that's not much to worry. All you have to do is press delete, but not my time. So all the physical bullying, it just happened during my time in the 80s.
Yeah. How did your family acclimate to being together again? I mean, I'm sure there was so much jubilation, but also it's like you don't even know who each other are anymore. And it's kind of your dad and you probably were such a unit, with you cooking your own dinner, and then you have, your mother and these siblings. And
yeah, that is a good point. When my mom and my siblings came over, it was rather funny. I'll say, "Hey, Mom, let me cook. Let me show you the way I'm cooking." And Mom would be like, "Well, what's that? That's not even food. What are you cooking?" I'm like, "Oh, well, I've been cooking like this for years. Dad is fine with it." It took a while because for me, coming to America at an early age, I was more living with people, people as in Vietnamese people in the southern part. Now, I came from the central. I was born in central Vietnam, where we have a thicker accent. The southern is different type of accent, but because I've been living with them so long that I'm just used to that, and I cannot go back to my central Vietnam accent again. So I must confess, there were times that I didn't even understand my own mom and my siblings. I was like, okay, I just did not understand what you just said, Mom. And she was furious. She goes, "What? You're my child, and then you don't even understand me?" And that took a while. That took a while for me to get used to the accent again, in order to understand Mom. For my dad, it was fine with him, because I mean, Dad lived 30 some years in central Vietnam, so the accent sticks with him. But for me, it was more me adapting to my mom, because certainly she's not gonna adapt to me. Based on just the language itself, took time, but everything else was slowly. I mean, my dad was always a father figure for me. So I mean, a father figure as well as a mother figure, because I I've been with him for so long
Mhm.
that I'm more attached to him. So everything that I would share with him versus sharing with mom. And there are times, mom would say, well, why are you not talking to me as much as you talk to your dad and stuff like that. And I try to understand that as I get older. So I'm trying to spend more time with mom and make her feel comfortable as though that she never lost me.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so your dad, what kind of engineer did your dad become?
Yeah, so he got a bachelor in electrical engineering, and his
Mhm.
master is in environmental engineering.
And what did he do in the US with those degrees?
It's so funny how he indirectly paved the way for me. So when he got his electrical engineering degree, he worked for a wastewater treatment plant, Department of Environmental Protection in New York City.
Mhm.
So he was working with them there. And then in 1998, he got a job here in Virginia with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. Now, when he got a job with in short, we call it USPTO. When he got a job here, they told me, they said, "Yo, look, you have to work." And so Dad was like, "Well, I still have a few more months in school to get my master's degree," and so they said, "Well, you still have to work, and we if you don't take the position now, we don't know when it's gonna open again." So Dad got home and he told the entire family. He said, I'm we're gonna I'm going to work in Virginia and I'm going to school in New York City. I was like, Dad, why you have to do all that? They don't need a master degree. You don't need to. He goes, well, I'm just so deep into it already. So so Sunday night, he would drive 4 hours to Virginia and stay at his friend's house. He would work from Monday until Friday night. He would drive back to New York City to be with the family. And then he would do his homework, give it to me. And so I would give it to his professor. Apparently, we have the same professor, except just different that, the
Different
professor,
levels.
yeah, apparently it was teaching undergrad and grad at the same time. Which is also scary too, because I was like, can you not tell my dad about my grades? And so that's how he did it for at least 2 months, and it was amazing seeing him do that. So when I graduated, which was the same time with him, so he moved the entire family to Virginia. And I told him, I said, well, I don't want to leave Virginia yet, so I want to stay in New York City. So then I applied for a job actually I applied for a job in Long Island as a test engineer. And then a couple months later, I applied for a job at DEP, which he had worked before moving to Virginia. And I worked in at DEP for a couple years. And then one day I felt kind of lonely. I'm like, okay, Dad, you're in Virginia with Mom and the entire family. I'm the only one here left. So I flew to Virginia. He said, why don't you work at the USPTO with me? And I said, nah, I'm more of a hands-on guy. I don't want to work for the federal government. I feel too restricted. And then he said, just give it a shot anyway. So I put in my application, I applied for it, flew down to Virginia, got an interview, and then I got an offer. So it was 2000, late 2000, and that's when I decided to say, okay, you know what, I'm going to join PTO. And then it's just so funny. Once again, Dad and I not just only go to school together, now we actually work together. That's why I said, sometimes I feel as though he paved the way for me, but none of this was planned at all. And I tell Dad, I'm like, Dad, remember those times that we would, have lunch and dinner together, when we were in school? Now we did the same exact thing, working together. I'm extremely happy for him that he retired from the USPTO. I would say 3 years ago. Yeah, 3 years ago he retired. Now I'm still with the USPTO. It has been 23 years for me at the USPTO now, and to finally see my dad retire, I felt so happy for him. I'm like, Dad, you can finally rest.
Yeah.
He worked
Gosh.
so, sorry, I'm just, especially after reading your book and hearing more,
Yeah.
it's just incredible how much your dad worked and some of the toll it took on him. You talk in your book about how he developed ulcers at a certain point, and it just, it was amazing.
Yeah, for the ulcer, he had it. He had it when he was in Vietnam, and I remember vividly too. He told his grandfather, he told my grandpa. He said, Dad, just kill me. The pain is just horrendous. I cannot stand it anymore. Just kill me. That also happened when we were living in the South Bronx. Times where we were in the apartment where his stomach ulcer would just flare up, and he would just lying on the bed and holding the pillow on his stomach, and he was crying, screaming, and he said, I'm gonna die. And that time I was 9 years old. I stood there helpless looking at him, and I was bawling. I'm like, Dad, stop saying that. I'm like, if I don't have a mom, and now you talk about you're gonna be dead, who I'm gonna live with. And it was so scary. And I don't know how he did it. He'll be in pain, and then when the pain subsided, he'll go back, sit on the table and start studying again. And that has been him for so long, until 1996 or 1997, when he met this doctor, and the doctor said, the ulcer was caused by H. pylori. It's a bacteria that's inside your stomach that's eating up your lining. And when that doctor discovered that and went in, give Dad antibiotics, completely went away, and that's when his life changed. And I mean, nowadays I hear people talk about H. pylori, and I'm like, yes, when you have stomach pain, stomach ulcer, that's the first thing you should check. And thank goodness that doctor found it. Yeah.
Yeah. I can't believe he lived with it that long. That's amazing.
Yeah. I'm surprised he hasn't got a hole in his stomach by now.
Yeah.
Because H. pylori, I thought stomach cancer is like the number one cancer for Asians because of H. pylori. If I'm not mistaken, yeah.
Huh.
Has your dad ever gone back? You've gone back to Vietnam, but has your dad ever gone back to Vietnam?
So that's the thing, yeah. Sometimes I do believe in the law of attraction. Dad went back 2 times already. He went back 2 times already. I think he first went back 4 years ago, and then he went back last year. I have never been back. I never had the urge to go back. It was always in my head, and I'm like, we left the country due to communism, right? And now we going back there. Really, for what purpose? And so I never had the urge to go back. It just so happened that 2 months ago, a friend reached out to me and said, because right now I also do motivational speaking as well. And so he said, I want you to go back to Vietnam with me so that you can do a keynote. I'm like, oh, okay, what do you want me to speak on? He said, well, I'm planning to build a hospital over there because cancer is on the rise in Vietnam, and I want to gather doctors together in order to build a cancer treatment facility. And I'm looking for a keynote speaker, and I would like you to come and speak for me. And so I talked to my wife about it, and I was like, you know what, this is a good cause. And my plan was just to go there, speak for like it's a 2-day conference, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna fly over there 2 days, speak for 2 days, and then rest for 1 day and come back within 5 days. And she was like, okay, and so that was the plan. It so happened that my daughter right now is in college. She goes to George Mason University, and it's winter break. And so I asked my daughter, I was like, hey, Laura, you want to go to Vietnam with Dad? And she's like, okay. And I was like, since I'm going to Vietnam, why not go back and visit my hometown? And I told my wife about it. I said, you know what? I'm right after the conference, I think I'm gonna fly back to Hue, and I want to visit my hometown. And she's like, well, if you can do it, go ahead. So I asked my daughter, I'm like, is it okay if we're gonna do that? And she's like, yeah, Dad, I'm gonna have school right when we come back. So apparently, the day that she came back, which was 2 days ago, she started school the next day, and she's still struggling with jet lag now. But I am so glad, so glad that I made this decision to go back and visit my hometown, because I finally get to see the home that I grew up in. So everything that I detail in the book, it was exactly it. The home that I used to live in, because it was made of the roof was hay, so it's all blown. But I still have a cousin there, and he was able to keep the wall of the home. Everything else was just torn down, but he was able to keep the wall. So I took a picture of the wall. My house has 6 coconut trees. All 5 died except for 1. So I took that picture with my daughter, and I was so happy. And I said, and I posted on Facebook yesterday too. And I said, thank goodness 1 tree stay alive to wait for me to come back. And then we walked from the house down to the beach, and there was that boat, the same exact boat that we took in 1982. And my cousin was like, yeah, this was the boat that you guys took on that journey. And you just can't imagine what people would do in order to find freedom. We couldn't care less about our lives. And I look at the boat, and I was like, oh my goodness. Now, if you tell me to get in that boat, I would be scared to death. But when you are desperate already, you would just do anything. You just do anything to change your life. And when I look at that boat, I can finally understood the meaning of freedom, and why people, the Vietnamese people, did something like that back in the right after the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
And I took so many pictures of it. I wish I could have something to share, but the only thing that I have to share now is just pictures of what I took, because back in the 80s or the 70s, when I was living there, we were just so poor. People, especially people in the countryside like myself, we were so poor. I don't think we ever seen a camera before, let alone taking a picture.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I mean, your country was just so devastated from the conflict that were, from the French and, Americans. And
Right.
so how is the interaction with family that stayed behind, like your cousin? How does he feel about your life trajectory versus his life trajectory?
Life in Vietnam right now for him is still very hard. It's still very hard, and he's still counting on people like myself, relatives like myself, to be able to send him some money in order for him to survive. Looking for a job in Vietnam, it's not as easy. Their pay it's extremely low. He was also my cousin is actually 20 years older than me, because he's the son of my father's sister, and my father and his sister are also like 15, 20 years apart.
Mhm.
Back in Vietnam during that time, especially living on a farm, every family has many kids, and so just to give you a range, my cousin is 20 years older than me. He also escaped the country as well. He's also one of the boat people as well. He left with his wife and his 4 kids. And when he arrived to Hong Kong, he stayed there for 6 years. 6 years in Hong Kong. Back in the 1990s, that's when Hong Kong closed the border and said, we will no longer accept Vietnamese refugees. So after 6 years, they sent him and his family back. So so they all live in Vietnam right now. It's difficult. My village is still poor. The only differences that I see right now is that they have electricity, and the sand that I grew up on has been filled with cement. So now people are walking on cement instead of walking with a bucket of water like I had. So that change with the cement helps. They build street now, that helps. Back then it would take like half a day from the countryside to the city. Now it only takes 30 minutes because now we have roads and stuff like that. But if he would have a choice, I'm sure that he would rather be here, so his life can be better, and his entire family.
Then when he was sent back, did he face any kind of punishment or anything like that for leaving in the first place?
Lucky for him,
Uh-huh.
it was agreed upon in 1990 that if any of the refugees were to send back, that nothing were to happen to them.
Okay.
So that was right. That was a good thing, because that was the biggest fear, right? I mean,
Right.
back then, if you leave, you get caught, you get really punished, right?
Mhm.
As much as death.
Mhm.
But during his time, because they sent back hundreds of thousands of people, and so it was agreed. It was agreed that no harm were to be done.
That's good.
Have you all maintained any Vietnamese traditions as you've acclimated into American culture?
Yeah. So Vietnamese New Year, it's always a big thing, right? We call it Tết, which is the Lunar New Year. Tết in the Vietnamese culture is basically to represent new life, prosperity, and we always give that red envelope, right? So that's one of the tradition that we never stop. Every New Year we give a red envelope. You put whatever amount of money you want to put in there, because it just represents good luck money. So that's the tradition that we never stop. The other tradition is to make rice cake. It's just basically a rice covered. No, actually, we put mung bean, green beans, and a slice of pork, and we cover with rice, and we cover with banana leaves. So that's the tradition, that a New Year, red envelope with that rice cake, perfect. And that's the tradition that I get involved every year with my mom, and I help her make those. And it takes a long time. It takes like 10 to 12 hours just to boil and cook that one that rice cake.
Oh. So what do you like best about living in Virginia and America?
America has given me a new life. America has given me opportunity. Whether I'm in Virginia or New York, it is still America that has changed me. It has given me so much that right now, especially after the Vietnam trip that I just got back from 2 days ago, um, I would like to go back and see how much I can help over there. Uh, Everything that has given to me here in America, uh, I feel as though it's time for me to pay back. I get involved a lot here in the community in Virginia. Either I'm helping the Vietnamese community, or I'm helping communities as the homeless community in Virginia. But now I just want to expand a little bit that to see if I can help those in Vietnam as well. But it all started basically that trip coming here. If it was in America, I wouldn't have this opportunity to even talk to both of you today. So I am blessed, and I am happy, and I owe a lot to America.
Well, and we're thankful to have you here as a citizen.
Thank you.
Do you think that you were talking about the cancer center that your friend is trying to start? Do you think that we talked to a lot of veterans and they said Agent Orange, caused a lot of cancers in their bodies, the exposure to the chemicals that the U.S. military used. Do you think that that is part of the influence?
So that has been, that has been the in the talk in the 1970s when the orange powder. I am sure that would also be part of it as well. Besides the country that is still pretty poor. In the city, you can see it's a little bit cleaner, but when you go out to the countryside and then you see garbage piling up, you see stagnant water, and you just don't get that clean water. So just imagine on a daily basis you breathing in bad air, you drinking dirty water. Eventually it's going to attack your body somehow. It can be that it can be also from the orange powder as well, because that was in the talk for a long time, right? I don't know how much we have cleaned it up, or we can never clean it up.
Yeah. When you think about the things that we do in the United States and how they're trying to remediate sites and things like that, I wonder if Vietnam has the same capabilities
Right.
to do that. Yeah. Emily, are there any questions you want to ask Len?
Yeah, please. Well, after moving to Virginia in the 90s, it seems like there's a pretty vibrant Vietnamese American community there. So are there any particular places or institutions or centers there that, that you think are sort of important to the Vietnamese American community?
Yeah, certainly. And I was so happy actually when I moved to Virginia and I found out that there is an Eden Center, right?
Mhm.
Because you only hear Orange County when you go to California.
Uh-huh.
Big populated area for Vietnamese people. So when I left New York City to come to Virginia, I was like, oh my goodness, this thing is like home. You drive up, you see Vietnamese stores all over, because you don't get that in New York City. New York City, it's more of a Chinatown, right? More of a Chinese atmosphere. So my very first stop at Eden Center, I was like, oh my goodness, it feels so good to hear Vietnamese voices. And when I decided to live in Virginia, that's when I found out, there's so many other organizations that the Vietnamese community are organizing in order to commemorate, the fall of Saigon and to acknowledge, the Vietnamese veterans. And I feel as though, this is such a great cause. If I were to continue to live in New York City, I'd probably not be exposed to that. But because of living in Virginia, seeing more, Vietnamese people and seeing all of these organizations that are, have been established by the Vietnamese community here, I just want to, give a helping hand right away. As a matter of fact, right now, I am one of the board of directors under this organization called the Vietnamese Boat People. And it was just as recent as last month that I get to interview, people like myself, Vietnamese boat people, and talk about, our journey. We talk about, what were some of the obstacles that we were faced at sea. And as a matter of fact, we're planning to do one even this April. This April, where we're gonna be interviewing, people like myself. And I'm sure, that there's just the community here in Virginia is so huge that there are people are willing to share. And I believe that it's about time that people are sharing their journey. Part of the reason is because, after my generation, like my kids, they don't know much. They don't know much on how we had to endure, the sufferings, these obstacles, in the middle of the ocean, to give them, a life right now, and to preserve that history. I feel so honored to be part of the board of directors.
Yeah, that's great. And your wife is Vietnamese too. Could you tell us how you met her and a little bit about her story, please?
Sure. So my wife actually came to America when she was at the age of 16. She was not a both people, but she was under another program where also the U.S. government signed an agreement that if you are a relative of the military, either U.S. military or a Vietnamese military during the Vietnam War, that you're able to be sponsored over. So apparently her grandfather sponsored her entire family over, and that took a good 10 years before she got sponsored over. So when she got sponsored over, she was living in New Jersey. It just so happened that she moved to Virginia before I did. I moved to Virginia in 2000, and it was one apparent day where I drove my mom to a Buddhist temple, and I saw this, fabulous lady stepping out from of her car with her mom, and that's when she caught my attention. Next thing I knew, I talked to her, and that was it. And we have been married for the last 20. Oh my goodness, she's gonna come down here, but you forgot. 21 years. Yeah, my daughter's 20. So yes.
It's lovely.
Thank you.
Well, do you have any more questions, Emily? Or we always like to ask in the end, is there something that we haven't asked you that you wished we would have asked you about your experience leaving Vietnam and coming to America?
No, I think, and I can't even believe I just look at the clock. I'm like, wow, this is it's almost 2 hours. And I have to admit, I've done, a lot of these interviews and sharing my stories. None of them have gone, beyond an hour. So I believe I have shared a lot, and I love all the questions that, both of you are asking. So yeah, I don't know how much that I haven't shared.
It's been a very interesting interview, so it has not felt like 2 hours to me.
I agree. Yeah.
This is great, and it's kind of funny because when I was in Vietnam, I texted my wife. I said, "Yeah, when I go home, I have to make sure that I have to get enough sleep because I'm gonna have an interview, you know, I don't want to interview and be half asleep. But you know, this has been so great, and I'm very honored to share my story in order to add into, you know, this collection of you know, what you are doing for the Vietnamese community.
We appreciate your time. And I'm going to stop the recording now, but it won't stop us being able to talk. So
No problem.